Sir John Franklin led 129 souls into the unforgiving Arctic, chasing a dream. They sailed into an icy oblivion, leaving only an enduring, terrifying mystery. In 1854, nearly a decade after the Franklin expedition vanished, a search party traveling across the ice of King William Island in the Canadian Arctic encountered the skeletal remains of a man. He was arranged carefully beneath a cairn of stones, as if placed there with intention. The remains were identified as John Torrington, a young sailor from HMS Terror. His body had been preserved by the eternal cold, his face peaceful in death, his clothing neat. Nearby, other graves were found, and on the ice, in the snow, scattered across a landscape as white and silent as death itself, lay the bones and the artifacts of men who had not simply died but had suffered in ways that defied description. These bones told a story that would take more than a century to fully understand. In May of 1845, Sir John Franklin had departed from England aboard HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, two specially reinforced ships that had previously explored Antarctica. He was an experienced officer, a veteran of Arctic exploration, a man of reputation and confidence. With him were 129 men, officers, sailors, marines, and civilians. They were sailing into history, they believed, to conquer the Northwest Passage, that legendary route through the Arctic that would connect Europe to the Pacific. They had food and supplies that were calculated to last 3 years. They had the best equipment available in the Victorian era. They had the confidence of the British Empire behind them. They had no idea that every single one of them would be dead within 7 years, their ships crushed by ice, their bodies scattered across the frozen wasteland they had sought to master. The discovery of John Torrington's remains was a beginning, not an ending, of the questions that would occupy historians and scientists for generations. How had they died? Why had there been no return, no message, no trace for so long? What had transformed a confident, well-supplied expedition into a tragedy so complete that entire crews had been obliterated? The answers lay frozen in the ice, waiting to be discovered. Sir John Franklin was 60 years old when he accepted command of the Arctic expedition, the capstone of a career spent in exploration. He had already sailed to the Arctic multiple times. He had commanded the HMS Erebus on an expedition to Antarctica. He was not a reckless man. The expedition was comprehensively planned. The two ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, were the most advanced polar exploration vessels available, their hulls reinforced with oak and elm, their engines capable of pushing them through pack ice. The hold of each ship was loaded with provisions calculated down to the ounce: salt pork, biscuits, preserved vegetables, lime juice to prevent scurvy, and, most crucially, thousands upon thousands of tinned canned foods. Canning was the cutting edge of food preservation technology. Franklin's supplies included almost 30,000 tins of various provisions. The crew of 129 was selected for reliability and skill. Many had previous Arctic experience. Officers brought scientific instruments to chart the waters and observe the magnetic variations. The expedition departed from Greenhithe on the Thames River on May 19, 1845, amid public fanfare and confidence. Newspapers proclaimed it a triumph waiting to happen. The passage was thought to be navigable, merely difficult. Franklin had the resources, the experience, and the support of the Royal Navy and the British nation. His final letter to the Admiralty, written just before departure, expressed quiet confidence. The route he planned to follow was already partially known. He would sail west up Wellington Channel, turn south around Prince of Wales Island, then follow King William Island down and out into the Back River, leading to Hudson Bay. It was an ambitious route through some of the most dangerous waters on Earth. But Franklin believed it was achievable. No one aboard HMS Erebus or HMS Terror as they sailed into the Arctic knew they were sailing toward oblivion. The last confirmed contact with Franklin's expedition occurred in July of 1845, when a whaling ship encountered HMS Erebus and HMS Terror trapped in the pack ice off Baffin Island. The ships were in good condition. The supplies appeared adequate. The crew seemed healthy and optimistic. They were preparing to push deeper into the Arctic, following the planned route. Franklin had dispatched a message to the Admiralty indicating that all was well. The expedition would maintain radio silence, there was no radio, and nothing would be heard from them again until they emerged on the other side of the Arctic, or until rescue became necessary. But the Arctic ice is not a passive obstacle. It is a living, dynamic system of pack ice that drifts and compresses, that opens and closes at the whim of currents and temperature and wind. In the winter of 1846 to 1847, the ships became trapped in the pack ice off King William Island, an island so isolated, so remote, and so thoroughly unknown to British navigators that Franklin may not have fully understood its significance even as his ships became locked in its grip. The ice that trapped them was not the thin, temporary pack ice that summer could melt. This was consolidated ice from multiple winters, ice that was thick enough to crush wooden ships like toys. The ships could not move under their own power. They had to wait for the ice to shift and open, a wait that could last months or years. They had supplies, they had shelter, they had experience. What they did not have was an exit strategy. The ice surrounding them would not release them. The route that was supposed to lead to rescue would prove impassable. And the men aboard these ships, isolated in a frozen wasteland, would begin the slow process of dying, of freezing, of starving, of succumbing to diseases that no amount of planning could have prevented. Aboard HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, trapped in ice for what would prove to be endless winters, the reality of the situation gradually became inescapable. The ships were locked in place. The ice showed no signs of releasing them. The supplies, so carefully calculated for a 3-year expedition, were being consumed by men who were not exploring but merely surviving. The Arctic winter is a season of darkness so complete that it borders on the absolute. For months, the sun does not rise above the horizon. The temperature plummets to depths that shatter metal and freeze human breath into clouds of crystalline particles. The wind howls across the ice with a sound like the voice of something alive and hungry. Inside the ships, in the small spaces where the men were crowded, the warmth from the coal-burning stoves and from human bodies created a pocket of relative comfort. But the cold was a constant, creeping presence, penetrating every layer of clothing, every blanket, every space that was not directly warmed. The disease began early. Scurvy, caused by lack of vitamin C, manifested in the form of bleeding gums, loosening teeth, and weakness that progressed toward paralysis and death. The ships carried lime juice intended to prevent it, but the lime juice had been stored for years in conditions that degraded its potency. It was not enough. Tuberculosis and other respiratory diseases spread through the crowded spaces. The canned foods that were meant to sustain them were being consumed in the darkness, but some of those cans had been sealed with solder containing lead. Lead poisoning, though not yet understood as such, was entering the systems of the men with every meal. Franklin himself died aboard HMS Erebus on June 11, 1847, after commanding the expedition for only 2 years. He was buried at sea, in the ice, beneath the Arctic that had claimed him. The men aboard the ships, now led by Francis Rawson Crozier, the commander of HMS Terror, had to accept a terrible truth: they were not going to sail out of the Arctic. They were going to have to walk. In April of 1848, more than 2 years after becoming trapped in the ice, the surviving officers and men of HMS Erebus and HMS Terror made the decision to abandon their ships. Approximately 105 men were still alive at this point. They were equipped with provisions intended to last until they could reach the Back River and travel down it to Hudson Bay, where rescue awaited. The back of the ships, the sternpost sections, could not be carried. The men had to select carefully what they would take: food, weapons, navigational instruments, and the heavy boats that would be essential if they encountered open water. The weight of what they carried was immense, probably over 800 pounds per boat, meaning multiple men had to haul each boat across the ice and over the land. They were malnourished, weakened by scurvy and lead poisoning, their bodies wasted from years of confinement and inadequate diet. The journey they had planned would be approximately 150 miles overland to the Back River, then another 200 miles downriver to the sea. Under normal circumstances, with healthy men and adequate supplies, this would be a difficult march. These were not normal circumstances. The men were dying. As they traveled south across the ice and through the rocky terrain of King William Island, men began to fall behind. Some were carried. Some could not be carried and were left. The snow and the cold and the exhaustion began to claim them, one by one. The food was running out faster than anticipated. The caches they had left for themselves, marked on their maps, were missed or had been disturbed. Desperation set in. The men were hungry, growing weaker, and still hundreds of miles from any possible rescue. Some of the men developed an obsession with the food that remained. Cannibalism is a word that appears in some historical accounts, whispered in Victorian drawing rooms, but the evidence for it is fragmentary and ambiguous. The accounts of Inuit who found the remains of the expedition mixed with what may have been ceremonial grave robbing or simply the scattering of bones by animals. What is beyond doubt is that the men died, their bodies left where they fell, or cached carefully by their companions in the desperate hope that they might be recovered someday. When Franklin's expedition failed to return in 1847, the Admiralty was not immediately alarmed. Expeditions sometimes took longer than expected. The Arctic was vast and navigation through it was uncertain. But as the months turned into years with no message, no signal, no indication of the whereabouts of the ships, concern grew into alarm. The Admiralty launched search expeditions. Private sponsors funded explorers who would brave the Arctic in hopes of discovering Franklin and rescuing his men. For more than a decade, almost every year saw new expeditions pushing into the Arctic searching for the lost explorer. The search parties found evidence of the expedition. They found remnants of supplies, fragments of equipment, marks on rocks indicating the passage of men. But they found no Franklin, no clear explanation of what had happened. The Arctic revealed its secrets reluctantly. The search expeditions themselves were sometimes nearly as dangerous as the original expedition had been. Men died in the search for Franklin. Ships were damaged or destroyed. The wilderness of the Arctic had its own claims on the explorers who entered its domain. Gradually, by the 1850s, the official search was scaled back. It was becoming clear that Franklin's expedition was not going to emerge from the Arctic. But the mystery of exactly what had happened to them, of where they had died, of what had killed them, remained unsolved. The Victorian public was fascinated by the mystery. Elaborate theories were proposed. Perhaps they had been killed by natives. Perhaps they had found an open polar sea and were navigating it still. Perhaps they were stranded on an island waiting for rescue. The lack of concrete evidence meant that the imagination could fill the void, and it did, with stories and fantasies about the lost explorer and his men. What was being ignored, what was being deliberately dismissed, were the accounts of the Inuit people who lived in the Arctic and who had been eyewitnesses to the tragedy. The Inuit people of the Arctic had witnessed the arrival of Franklin's ships. They had observed the entrapment and the slow death of the men. They had found the bodies and the wreckage. They had stories to tell. When explorers like John Ray began to interview the Inuit and to gather their accounts, a clearer picture of the disaster began to emerge. The Inuit described seeing men who were starving, men who were walking south across the ice, men whose bodies lay scattered on the land and in the snow. They described large structures, the ships, trapped in the ice, and the desperate attempt to escape by traveling overland. Ray, in 1854, gathered accounts from the Inuit and reported that the men of Franklin's expedition had attempted to travel south toward the Back River and that many had died along the way. He even reported, based on Inuit testimony, evidence that suggested the survivors may have resorted to cannibalism in their final, desperate days. The Victorian society that Ray reported these findings to was scandalized. The idea that British officers, men of refinement and education, could be driven to such extremity was appalling. Rather than accept the testimony of the Inuit, the British establishment rejected it. They questioned Ray's credibility. They suggested that the Inuit were mistaken or lying. They preferred uncertainty to the harsh reality that the Inuit testimony offered. For more than a century, the accounts of the Inuit were marginalized and dismissed. The peoples of the Arctic, the ones who had the best knowledge of what had actually happened to Franklin's expedition, were ignored. It was not until the late 20th century, when historians began to take indigenous testimony seriously and to integrate Inuit oral history into the historical record, that the truth began to emerge. The Inuit had been right. They had been eyewitnesses to a tragedy that was far more gruesome and far more desperate than the Victorian establishment had been willing to acknowledge. The remains of Franklin's expedition began to be discovered in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Graves were found, bones were recovered, artifacts were collected. With each discovery, the physical evidence added detail to the story that the Inuit had been trying to tell. The skeletons showed signs of severe malnutrition. The bones were marked by the deep gouges and marks of cutting, consistent with the butchering of human flesh. Some remains showed signs of scurvy, the characteristic lesions and bone damage of the vitamin deficiency disease. Other remains showed signs of tuberculosis and other infections. The clothing and the artifacts suggested an orderly attempt at survival, the men maintaining military discipline and order even as they were dying. One of the most significant discoveries was made when lead analysis was performed on the remains and on the artifacts from the expedition. The solder used to seal the tin cans of provisions contained lead. Months and years of consuming food from these cans would have resulted in the accumulation of lead in the bodies of the men. Lead poisoning, particularly chronic low-level lead poisoning, can cause a constellation of symptoms: weakness, joint pain, cognitive decline, hallucinations, and irritability. It is possible that some of the men were suffering from lead poisoning in addition to scurvy and starvation. The combination of these factors, lead poisoning, scurvy, tuberculosis, starvation, and the psychological stress of abandonment and desperation, would have been lethal. The physical evidence showed that the men had not simply frozen to death in a single cataclysmic event. They had died slowly, over months and years, from a combination of causes. Some had died aboard the ships. Others had died during the march south. Still others, perhaps, had died in the desperate camps they established as they slowly moved toward a rescue that would never come. The men of Franklin's expedition died from multiple causes, each exacerbated by the others. Starvation was the overarching killer. The stores that had been calculated to last 3 years had to sustain the expedition for much longer than anticipated. As the years accumulated and men died, the remaining survivors had to stretch the supplies further and further. But starvation is not a simple process of dying from hunger. It is a cascade of physiological breakdown in which the body begins to consume itself, in which the immune system fails, in which the organs begin to shut down. A starving man is vulnerable to every disease, every infection, every illness that might present itself. Scurvy, caused by the deficiency of vitamin C, ravages the body in particularly terrible ways. The gums bleed and swell, making eating painful and difficult. The old wounds and the scars reopen as the collagen that holds the body together breaks down. The victim becomes lethargic and depressed, the mind as affected as the body. The lime juice that Franklin's expedition carried was meant to prevent scurvy, but lime juice degrades over time, and the juice that had been stored for years in the holds of ships had lost much of its potency. Some of the men may have received an adequate dose, but others probably did not. Lead poisoning, the silent killer that was accumulating in their bodies through months of eating tinned food, added a neurological component to the disaster. Lead attacks the nervous system, causing tremors, personality changes, confusion, and hallucinations. A man suffering from lead poisoning might have made decisions that were irrational, might have become violent or despondent, might have lost the will to survive. The Inuit accounts suggest that some of the men exhibited strange behavior, possibly consistent with lead poisoning or with the early stages of scurvy-induced dementia. As their supplies dwindled and their strength faded, the men faced a choice between staying put and hoping for rescue, or continuing to walk despite their weakness. They chose to walk, and that choice killed them. The bodies scattered across King William Island and the surrounding ice are the final evidence of men who died trying to save themselves. For more than 160 years, the ships HMS Erebus and HMS Terror lay on the bottom of the Arctic Ocean, entombed in ice and surrounded by the wreckage of supplies and equipment. The location of the wrecks had been suggested by Inuit testimony and by the scattered remains found on King William Island, but the actual ships themselves seem to have vanished without a trace. Modern technology, however, ultimately succeeded where previous searchers had failed. In 2014, a search team using underwater remotely operated vehicles located HMS Erebus on the ocean floor of the Arctic. The ship was partially buried in silt, but it was remarkably well preserved by the cold and the anaerobic conditions of the deep Arctic waters. The wooden hull showed the crushing and the damage consistent with being trapped in moving pack ice for years. Inside the ship, artifacts remained in place: navigational instruments, bottles, crew possessions. The discovery was a watershed moment. The myth of Franklin, the speculation and the theories, gave way to a tangible reality. 2 years later, in 2016, HMS Terror was discovered intact on the ocean floor in Terror Bay, named for the ship that had taken refuge there. Both ships were in remarkably good condition, their structures recognizable, their locations consistent with what the Inuit had reported and what the historical record suggested. The discovery of the wrecks allowed for the collection of additional artifacts and evidence. The cans that had contained the poisoned food were recovered. Equipment that had been left aboard was documented. The ships themselves became a kind of archive, a repository of information about the men who had sailed them and the journey that had killed them. The discovery also vindicated the Inuit testimony. What they had reported generations earlier was confirmed by the physical evidence. The ships were where the Inuit had said they would be. The details of the disaster that the Inuit had provided were consistent with what the wrecks revealed. The rediscovery of Inuit testimony as a valid historical source has transformed our understanding of the Franklin expedition. What was once dismissed as second-hand gossip or contaminated by the prejudices of Victorian historians is now recognized as eyewitness accounts of genuine historical events. The Inuit people had watched the ships become trapped in the ice. They had seen the men attempting to walk south. They had found the bodies, had taken some of the artifacts from the wrecks, and had passed the stories down through the generations. When modern historians and archaeologists began to take these oral traditions seriously, to document them, and to integrate them with the physical and documentary evidence, a much clearer picture emerged. The Franklin expedition was not a mystery in the end. It was a tragedy that had been witnessed and recorded. The cause of the disaster was not supernatural or bizarre. It was the result of underestimating the Arctic, of inadequate food, of disease, and of the terrible gamble of attempting a long journey through one of the most hostile environments on Earth with technology and supplies that were ultimately insufficient. The vindication of the Inuit testimony serves as a reminder that the peoples of the Arctic had expertise and knowledge that the British explorers lacked. The Arctic was not a blank wilderness waiting to be conquered. It was a place that had been inhabited and understood for thousands of years. The dismissal of Inuit accounts in the 19th century was not simply an error of historical judgment. It was a manifestation of the racism and the prejudice that characterized the Victorian era. The truth about Franklin had been available all along. It was simply not believed because it came from sources that the Victorian establishment deemed unreliable. The delay in accepting the Inuit testimony meant that the true story of the Franklin expedition was hidden for more than a century. Sir John Franklin and the 128 men under his command did not vanish into mystery or into the Arctic wilderness in some romantic sense. They died in a specific way, from specific causes, over a period of years, their journey ending not in discovery but in desperation. The Northwest Passage that they were attempting to navigate existed, but not in a form that 19th-century sailing ships could traverse. The passage exists, but it is choked with pack ice much of the year. Modern icebreaker ships and submarines can navigate it. Wooden sailing ships cannot. Franklin's expedition was undone by the collision between ambition and reality, between Victorian confidence in British superiority and the fundamental hostility of the Arctic environment. The lead in the solder, the degraded lime juice, the miscalculation of how long the supplies would last, the underestimation of the ice, the failure to listen to the peoples who lived in the Arctic, all of these contributed to the tragedy. Franklin himself died relatively early in the disaster, spared from the worst of the suffering that his men endured. The officers and men who survived him faced a horrifying choice between dying aboard the ships or dying in an attempt to reach rescue over land. They chose the march, and it killed them all. The discovery of the wrecks in 2014 and 2016 brought closure to a mystery that had haunted the public imagination for generations. The Inuit testimony was vindicated. The physical and historical evidence combined to create a clear narrative of what had happened. 129 men sailed into the Arctic in 1845. None returned. The Franklin expedition stands as a monument to human resilience and to human limitation, to the capacity for courage in the face of impossible circumstances, and to the dangers of arrogance and the failure to respect the environment and the peoples who understand it. The lesson of Franklin is not that the Arctic cannot be conquered. Modern expeditions prove that it can be navigated. The lesson is that the Arctic commands respect, that indigenous knowledge is invaluable, and that the cost of ignoring these truths is paid in human lives. Before you go, here's the thing. Every week we investigate another mystery the world could never solve. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And here's the most important part. The next case we investigate could be yours. Tell us in the comments which unsolved mystery, disappearance, or disaster we should cover next. We read every suggestion, and the stories that stay with you are the ones we bring to life.